Written in Bone, Chapter 7, The Lead Coffin People. As the team had suspected, the small coffin contained the skeleton of a child. In the 17th century Chesapeake area, death was an ever-present fact of life, especially for children, who were particularly vulnerable to disease and starvation. 1/4 of all the children born in Maryland during this period died during the first year of life. Of the survivors, almost half died before they turned 20. For a child to have 4 living grandparents was rare. In fact, a colonial child could expect that at least one parent, and maybe both, would die before that child grew up. As a result of the high death rate, remarriage and stepfamilies were very common. Most of the lead coffin child's bones seemed to be in good to excellent condition, a surprise, given that the fragile bones of children often decay rapidly. But the coffin also contained a mystery. The child's lower leg bones and feet were gone. Had they somehow been severed by an injury? Could such an event have been the cause of death? Let's go back and look at these pictures and the captions. Here we have Doug Owsley carefully brushing off the lid of the smallest coffin, thought to hold the remains of a child. So here it is right here. Here's Doug Owsley, and here is the child's coffin. See how tiny it is. He examines the exterior before opening it for the first time. And then we have this other picture. What he found inside was a surprise. The upper body of the child's skeleton was relatively complete, but the lower portion was missing. So we can see the top part of the skeleton, and then you see where there's nothing down here. As Doug Owsley and Carrie Bruelheide investigated further, they saw green stains left by copper shroud pins on the skull, the collarbone, the jaw, and a rib. Then conservators pointed out yet another amazing discovery: tiny fragments of the linen material that the St. Mary's City women had used to shroud the child. Traditionally, English women prepared the dead for burial. Fabric from 17th century colonial burials rarely survives the effects of time and decomposition. Occasionally, however, some fragments do. The lead coffin linen fragments were most likely preserved by the shroud pins in a fascinating example of the way the circumstances of a burial affect what remains, and does not centuries later. As Silas Hurry, the director of the archaeology laboratory at St. Mary's City, explained, copper is a fairly toxic, poisonous metal. When there are copper pins in contact with fabric, critters, insects, fungi, microscopic organisms, don't eat the cloth in contact with the copper. As the copper corrodes or decays, the material strands around it are preserved, almost like a fossil. Wondering how old the child had been, Bruelheide turned her attention to the cranium. Children's smaller craniums can also offer detailed information about a person's age at the time of death. An adult human skull is made of 28 bones, which includes the 6 ear bones. The bones of an adult's cranium are solidly fused together. At birth, however, an infant's skull needs to have a degree of flexibility to pass through the birth canal without being damaged. Further flexibility is needed as the infant grows and the skull changes. Thus, the bones of an infant's cranium are not fused together. Instead, fibrous joints called sutures fill the space between the bones. Sutures appear on the cranium as zigzagging lines. They're easy to see on the skulls of children, teenagers, and young adults. As a person gets older, the suture lines often become more intricate. This holds the cranium's bones more tightly together. Some of the sutures on the skull of an elderly person may fade and disappear completely. Thus, a forensic anthropologist can study sutures to estimate a person's age. In this way, Bruelheide determined that the child was very young, no more than a toddler. But how young? Let's look at the pictures here in their captions. Carrie Bruelheide, right here, examines the child's cranium, which is another word for skull, and she's looking for those zigzagging lines that indicate the age. Remember, those zigzagging lines are called the sutures, and you can see how they zigzag around the skull in this bottom picture. Bruelheide believed that the teeth might reveal the answer to that question. So she examined the child's mandible, or jaw. She saw that the height of 2 incisors indicated they had partly grown in while the child was alive. A baby's first incisors usually start to come in when the child is between 4 and 6 months old. The rest of the child's teeth had not yet formed. Based on these facts, Brühl-Heide estimated the child had been 5 to 6 months old at death. Only a baby. As Owsley and Brühl-Heide conducted their examinations, other team members studied the tiny coffin and the rest of its contents. The tiny coffin proved to have been built at a different time than the other two. 3 pieces of lead had been used in its manufacture. Careful comparison showed that they were not leftover scraps from the larger coffins, noted Silas Hurry. There are hammer marks on the lead. It had served another purpose, perhaps as a tabletop or a roof, before it had been turned into a coffin, he added. So right here we've got a picture of the teeth. By studying the teeth, or lack thereof, in the jawbone, Brühl-Heide concluded that the baby was only a few months old at the time of death. An unusual find within the coffin posed a puzzle. A layer of soil partially covered the body when the coffin was opened, while another layer lay beneath the baby's skull and upper body. It's normal to find soil from the grave shaft inside a coffin. The soil enters as the coffin decomposes. But the lead coffin hadn't decomposed. Even though it wasn't airtight, it had no gaps large enough for grave shaft soil to enter. One of the soil layers consisted of gray soil, the other was brown. So the soils clearly came from different places. Furthermore, both were different from the soil that had filled the grave shaft. Where had they come from, and when? The team considered a theory that the child may have initially been buried only in the wooden coffin that was found within the lead one. Sometime later, the wooden coffin was dug up, placed into the lead coffin, and reburied. The soil could have fallen into the wooden coffin during this process. Another possibility was that the soil had been used to prop the child's head and upper body higher in the coffin prior to burial so that grieving family members could more easily see the child when they paid their last respects. Given the 2 separate soil layers, both theories could have been correct. So right here we've got our picture. You see the layer of soil in the baby's coffin shows a white thin band, so right here. This is the bottom of the lead coffin, and above that is a dark brown layer on which the baby's body was resting, and the grayish soil layer was put over the baby. To gather more data, the team sent samples scraped from the surface of each layer to a laboratory for pollen analysis. Pollen, the tiny yellow grains found on the reproductive parts of plants, is produced by different plant species at varying times of the year. Any pollen that was floating in the air at the time the soils were placed in the coffin would have settled onto the surface. Identifying the pollen might therefore help the team determine during what season the soils were placed into the infant's coffin. Gerald Kelso, the team's paleontologist or pollen specialist, found that the 2 soils contained different types of pollen. One soil had pollen from an oak tree. The other had pine tree pollen. These tree species released their pollen at different times during the spring, suggesting that the soils were placed in the coffin at those times. Unfortunately, the soil analysis couldn't tell the team exactly where the soils came from or how they entered the coffin. Although this question continues to puzzle the team, they believe they figured out the answer to an earlier mystery, that of the baby's missing leg and foot bones. Because the coffin wasn't airtight, it must not have been watertight either. Over time, water droplets had seeped into the coffin and dampened the soil. Gravity pulled the water down through the slanted layer of soil to the area where the baby's lower legs and feet lay. The damp conditions caused the lower leg bones and feet to deteriorate and eventually disappear. The upper part of the skeleton remained intact because it wasn't exposed to as much moisture. Even when a baby's entire skeleton is well preserved, determining whether the child was a boy or a girl is almost impossible. The differences in skulls and pelvic bones that forensic anthropologists rely upon for this purpose generally aren't noticeable until a person has reached the teen years or beyond. Well, that said, Owsley could make an educated guess. The lead coffin baby had small teeth and a pointed chin. These factors, plus a wide angle in one area of the hip bone, suggest the baby was more than likely to have been a girl than a boy. So this image shows 2 cranium sections 2 ribs, the lower jaw, part of the upper jaw, and an arm bone that belonged to the lead coffin baby. Could Owsley and Brühlheide discover why the baby had died? As they examined the baby's cranium, they noticed a number of abnormal holes. Some were very tiny, others were as large as 0.2 inches. Abnormal holes of this kind are a sign of serious disease. They indicate that the child's bones were not forming properly as she grew. One condition that causes abnormal holes like the one found in the lead coffin baby's cranium is rickets, a disease resulting from lack of vitamin D, calcium, and sunlight. Rickets causes unhealthy bone changes in children. For example, the skull bones become thin, so they break easily. The ends of the ribs become flared, wider than normal. Other bones become soft enough to bend and bow into abnormal shapes. When Owsley and Brühlheide examined the baby's ribs, they found that the ends were flared exactly as one would expect in a child who suffered from rickets. Historical documents show that colonial mothers often kept their babies swaddled or wrapped tightly in cloth. Swaddling would have prevented the baby's body from absorbing sunlight, which, along with poor nutrition, could cause rickets. So here's our picture. And the baby's cranium had several large holes. You can see them here. Ooh, looks like, oh goodness, look at the large holes, 4 of them. They told researchers that the girl suffered from rickets. Another symptom of rickets is that the ribs flare abnormally at the ends. People who don't get enough vitamin D, calcium, and sunlight can get rickets. So you've got that right here. You can see in this picture. A second condition called anemia may have contributed to the lead coffin infant's death. Anemia is caused by a lower than normal number of red blood cells. These cells carry oxygen throughout the body. So, an anemic person suffers from insufficient oxygen in the organs. Anemia can cause severe weakness, fatigue, and paleness. A common cause of anemia is a lack of the element iron, found in leafy green vegetables and meat. In colonial times, doctors believed that people fell ill because their blood had turned bad. Making a cut in the patient's skin to release this supposedly bad blood, a practice called bloodletting, was one way doctors tried to cure sickness. Modern medical doctors know that removing blood weakens an ill person. If the lead coffin baby was bled as her illness worsened, as would have been the custom, she would have become sicker. Owsley and Brühlheide are certain that rickets and possibly anemia led to the little girl's death. The lead coffin baby offers clear proof that infants in the colonial Chesapeake were susceptible to many diseases. Given that the baby's family was wealthy, after all, only a wealthy family would be able to bury a child in a lead coffin, it seems likely that they would have spared no expense in her medical care. Even so, by the time she died, the lead coffin baby was a very sick child and had been so for some time. Her death appears to have been the result of her illnesses.